Well, how's it going, everyone? I hope you're having a great night. I know I am. I just had an amazing dinner with some of my gym mates, and actually went out to having a great night. Pot. I know I am. So amazing. I just dinner with some of my. Just wanted to start this channel a little bit, get it going. I know I've been a little bit late with the stream, but today we're going to talk about actually horror Thursdays, and I know I said that was a topic I was going to do every Thursday. So sorry for the inconvenience and sorry for the late stream. So let's get to it. I wanted to talk about Mothman Prophecies because this is actually one of my favorite horror movies, probably of them all. So just a bit of a background, I started this journey looking for good horror movies because throughout most of my life, horror movies were not scary to me. They were, they just were dumb. They were, gore fest or in your face scary for like a minute or two, but predictable. And I sort of found out that formulaic through almost every horror movie, and then they were just kind of not scary at all. I mean, they did still give me a fright, but I would just forget about it. So I went on a search looking for the best horror movies. This is probably like, I don't know, 10, 15 years ago. And the first one that actually truly scared me for days on end, which I regret to this day, but I actually still love it talking about it, is Mothman Prophecies. This is my favorite horror movie of all time. And the reason why is because it's not in your face jump scare. It's totally thriller and suspense. And I realized, at least for me, that's what makes a great horror movie, because it had more character depth. The actual monsters or supernatural that goes around it is kind of unknown. You're never really sure whether it's real, whether it's in someone's head. Also, just they added a deeper layer to it, and more that made it more scary. The fact is that it's based on some true events that happened in Point Pleasant, West Virginia, and that got me really scared because it was just creepy. I read all the backstory behind it. I've read all the or seen all the videos on YouTube. There's a myriad of conspiracy theories around it and stuff like that. It goes on and on. But here I just want to talk about the horror movie itself, what makes it a good horror movie, and I'm hoping that you'll enjoy this. And I hope that you'll discuss it as well and kind of get into it and give some feedback on it. So let's start with it. So Mothman Prophecies, it's with Richard Gere and Laura Linney, and there's a few other well-known actors in it who you've probably seen in many other films. But these are the two main actors who've, they've been in a few other. I think she actually did a film prior to this, and they've been in like all these other movies that you've seen here and there, so you'll recognize their faces. So Mothman Prophecies is loosely based on these events from the 60s and 70s that happened in Point Pleasant, West Virginia, and where people start seeing strange things from this Mothman looking like creature with red eyes. He was supposedly 8 to 10 feet tall, looked in people's houses, really creepy stuff, and it gives me the chills talking about it because I remember all the little details about it. People started seeing UFOs, even police officers started saying that there was weird stuff going on. They started getting weird calls from townspeople, just unexplainable things. And then also, there was a Men in Black element. People started seeing strange figures who were wearing, like the Men in Black type suit, the sunglasses, stalking people, and just every kind of creepy thing you can think of. But all culminated into the bridge on the River Ohio that ended up collapsing. I think this was mid-70s, and 46 people died, unfortunately. And no one knew what caused this, but later they found out it was actually a structural beam that was not right, and the bridge was built all wrong, and that's what caused the collapse. But either way, a lot of people still put the fact that the Mothman had something to do with this. Anyway, to get back into the movie, this is what the movie is based off of. However, it's not just a culmination of people's stories. They actually put in a whole plot to it. So the plot, basic premise is, and spoiler alert because we are going to be talking this from beginning to end, is we start off with Richard Gere, who is a high-profile journalist, and he's with the Washington Post. And he and his wife, Deborah Messing, they just buy a house. They're about to start their life, this whole happy couple family thing. And they get into a serious car accident because his wife just sees something comes at her while they're driving home, and they get into a terrible car crash, and she smacks her head. They go to the hospital, and they find out from MRIs and stuff that she actually has some kind of tumor, a rare tumor, and she's basically terminal. Uh, Eventually, she ends up dying, and you're left with Richard Gere, who's left mourning the loss of his wife. And it's now 2 years in, and he is trying to figure the things out. He's clearly lost. He's clearly just not happy and just kind of existing. And it culminates to him ending up in Point Pleasant. He doesn't know how he got there. I mean, we do know that he's supposed to be there for some kind of interview with the governor, but that's supposed to happen like days later or something like that. So he goes there and doesn't remember how he got there, doesn't remember the time, and ends up getting sucked into this creepy set of circumstances where people have been seeing things, and people have been, getting phone calls, and he really befriends actually one of the townspeople named Gordon. Gordon's been actually visited by someone strange and getting phone calls and hearing voices in sinks and through all kinds of like weird communications, and all of these voices tell him stuff that ends up happening, like people dying in plane crashes or earthquakes, and it's starting to mess with his mind. And Richard Gere, whose his character's name is John Klein, he just gets wrapped up in this, and he's trying to find answers and what this all means and how did he get there, and he gets wrapped up into the whole situation. Meanwhile, he's befriended the local police officer or the policewoman. Her name is I actually forget her name. I'm sorry, I'll look that up. But it's played by Laura Linney. They befriend each other because of the circumstances, and she's way more level-headed. She clearly doesn't buy into any of this, but she knows that something strange is going on. She admits it from the get-go that just something's up in the town, and it's like people who would normally not be saying these kinds of things or promoting these kinds of weird conspiracies, yet they're happening more and more just from ordinary people. And that's what kind of makes it scary, because it's just like everyday people, and it's not just one person. It's not the local crazy guy who Gordon definitely seems like he is, but then it's just other people start seeing stuff, and that's what makes it creepy. Moreover, John Klein is looking for answers about the death of his wife, because he knows that his wife saw something. She was drawing creepy pictures, just like all the horror movies do, and he's trying to find out what really killed her, because he doesn't buy the fact that a brain tumor killed her. And then he ends up finding out about this guy named John Keel, who is actually, funny enough, it's a bit of a misnomer. It's like his name is spelled backward of the original author of the book, The Mothman Prophecies, John Keel. And in the movie, he's John Leake. Or it's actually, I think, just Leake. I don't think we're ever given his full name. I thought that was kind of a little interesting tidbit. And Leake tells him that he's heard the same type of voices too, and it ruined his life, and he decided to just give all of that up. And he couldn't go on doing that. But he told him that they're a natural part of Earth or the universe, and even though they seem bad, it doesn't mean that they're necessarily bad. They're just kind of like a natural evil almost, maybe even a natural good, because they bring some kind of balance. But obviously everything about it and everything that they discuss about it just seems sinister. It doesn't seem right, and it doesn't seem human or based in reality, and it's just kind of creepy from there. Eventually it culminates to John Klein starts getting phone calls from a creepy guy named Injured Cold, who starts talking to him, knows all of the details he never told anyone, including like what he's holding in his hand, and he's the only one in the room. It's super creepy. I'm getting the chills just from talking about this stuff, because it still creeps me out to this day as one of the creepiest scenes in the movie. But when we come down to it, eventually it just becomes that he's chasing essentially a ghost, because he can't get over the death of his wife, and he has to believe that there was something else. And he kind of foreshadows that in the beginning of the movie, that it's as if the universe opened up and said, you you're a happy couple, I'm looking for you. And in a way that's kind of poignant because we often think that like bad things happen for some reason. You know, everyone says the old saying, "Oh, it happens for a reason," but in this case, there probably isn't a reason. It just happened because it happened, and the supernatural just kind of adds to it that it must be this. But there's many interpretations of this. Now, the reason I wanted to explore Mothman Prophecies is because I think it does stuff that other horror movies just don't do. For one, I think the cinematography is great. Um, it's, you know, it's not in the dark. A lot of it is actually during the daytime. You don't get scenes where you see something in the background or anything like that. In fact, a lot of the movie is not actually with the monster, and he appears very few times, and he gives the sense that um, maybe the monster's not even real. In fact, a lot of it in most horror movies, as you've seen, the monster's chasing people. It's like teenagers or people or someone through a house, dark forest, or it's a killer, that sort of thing. Like we've seen that played out a bunch of times. But what happens when the monster is being chased by the victims, and vice versa? Because as we see in the movie, Andrew Cole tells him, you know, they've already met, they've already seen each other. It depends on who's looking what that thing looks like, and that makes it really creepy because when we come down to it, the monsters are really just in our head, and I think that's a really poignant thing because John Klein is trying to find meaning, and he's putting so much energy into this entity that he has to believe that that's the monster. But it may also just be, you know, the monster's not real, it's in his head, and he's trying to find some kind of reason, and he can't find that. And I think this only culminates towards the end when Laura Linney's character, she tells him, you know, people die in car crashes, earthquakes, and, you know, voices can tell you all these things, but, you know, we still have Christmas, we still go about our day, we still have the holidays, we still live our lives. Like, you can't let this dictate your life. And she says that a few times, and I think that's what keeps her grounded and very human and away from all of it. Was John Klein. He's just so grief stricken. And another thing is it's based around grief because if you watch the movie, he has not cried at all since the time of death, and it's 2 years when the actual events start taking place. He doesn't actually make his first cry, I guess, or doesn't actually fully grieve with her until the end of the movie. And I think that's really poignant because of the fact that, like, he's just been holding it up inside, and I think that's a lot of people do. They hold stuff and they push it down, and they're trying to keep calm and, you know, not give in to that. But in a lot of ways, the Mothman made him realize that he misses his wife, and he's just got to get over her and got to grieve her, and this kind of pain is actually kind of a good thing, and that's kind of where he finally lets go. And it's not even that he's haunted by the monster, it's that she's not haunted by the monster either, and his wife has been dead for 2 years. And I think there's a nice sadness, melancholic theme there, and I think that's amazing. So that's one of the things I think that this movie got right. It's that the victim is actually chasing the monster. The monster doesn't actually want to be found. He exists in the world, or maybe he doesn't at all. And people go looking for him or looking for that reason. And I think that's something that no other horror movie does. The other thing too is that we never actually see the monster. And a few times that we hear him or see him, that the director does actually show us some kind of proof, it's still uncertain. You're never sure whether it's credible or whether it's a figment of the person's imagination or whether it's actually real. And I like that because I think at least in the one or two times that they do show it, this was some kind of entity, but he doesn't have enough physical or any kind of reality-based evidence. And even Alexander Leak in the film says he's not based in reality. You know, we see things, or we know of things all the time like that don't exist in front of our eyes, like electricity, air molecules. You know, we can't see these things, but we know they exist. And the director does a good thing of showing that, where, you know, we never are really sure, and unless we get some kind of, you know, hard concrete evidence, you know, it's just left open in the air. And I think that's amazing, because the whole movie is just left up to interpretation for that. And after the umpteenth time that I've seen this film, I'm more convinced now that most of the stuff that goes on in his head, in John Klein's, or I'm sorry, most of the stuff that happens to John Klein is in his head, because no one else is there to see it. No one else is there to verify it or know that it's true. He goes off of Gordon, who is kind of verification, but Gordon is also having problems, but they happen to have them at different times. You know, you never hear Indra Cold and Gordon and John Klein on the phone at the same time. You never see Indra Cold or the monster with more than two people. You just hear anecdotal stories, which we know are not credible. Even when Indra Cold calls him, you can also play out the fact that John Klein wants him to say these things, and even Indra Cold says, like, you already know what I'm going to tell you. You already have the proof. You already know what I'm going to say to you. That's almost proof enough to me that the monster is like, if there is a monster, that's like, I'm in your head. I'm just you. You're just talking to yourself in a hotel room alone. Which kind of makes it creepier, because it's just like, ugh. Anyway, it still gives me the creeps, that whole conversation anyway. But that's what I love about it, is that a lot of it's still left open to interpretation. And that's what I think it makes kind of an underrated film, because today most people want, like, you know, an axe murderer, or like demon possessing someone, or some kind of like crazy ghost that, you know, comes out at night. Always at night, but these happen during the day, these happen during the night. I mean, the creepiest parts happen at night, but a lot of it just happens to him throughout his entire existence of this whole movie. And nothing stops it. And then even the only times that the level-headed character, Laura Linney's character, as the policewoman, she actually never gives in. The only time she actually does think about giving in is when first off, when she doesn't know what she sees when she thinks she saw John Klein's wife, because someone walked into the police station asking for John Klein, and it just happened to look like his wife. Now, we never see this person, but we get a snippet that this was probably the ghost of his wife, or Indra Cole disguised as his wife, just playing tricks on him. And she admits, like, oh, I don't know, you know, like, she starts doubting herself, and that's the first time we actually see her doubt herself. The only other time that she actually believes it, or maybe possibly believes it, is when the bridge collapses, because she later, or earlier in the movie, she iterates to John Klein that she has this dream where she's in water holding presents or trying to stay afloat, and she starts drowning, and as she's drifting off into what we assume is death, into the depths, she hears a voice say, "Wake up, number 37." And she says this so vividly because she remembers it, that when the bridge collapses and they give the final count of all the dead, he said 36 people had died, and she was number 37. She was the one who was allowed to let live, and that makes it creepy. And the difference, though, between that scene and the previous one where she doubts herself is that, while it seems like she believes it, I think she thinks of it more of as a miracle, but like an angelic miracle, and that this was for good, that she has a reason why. But it also at the same time doesn't give the notion that it's going to profoundly change her life and that, oh, she believes now in everything that John Klein has said. I still feel like even at the end of the movie, she's just A, happy to be alive, because anyone would be if they almost drowned, and B, she was given a second chance, and she's not going to let some horrible entity like the Mothman rule her life. Whereas John Klein actually took, rehabilitation, and in a lot of ways, Laura Linney is like the, uh, I wouldn't say mother figure, but some kind of figure to him that finally gets him to accept and accept his loss and then move on and then possibly even end up being with her, because it seemed like they had some kind of chemistry, and it was all because of all these weird circumstances. So that's what I think this movie did far differently than any other horror movie. And that's what I like about this movie, because not only did it play tricks with your mind and also with your vision and kind of senses, because there's some parts, if you look closely, there's themes of the Mothman that happen during the day. There's shots that they show that I have to kind of go back to and look at. For example, in the very beginning when they buy their house and nothing's going wrong, when they zoom out from above them, they don't center on the couple. They don't center on John Klein and his wife. They center on the pathway through the snow, and it looks like Mothman antennae, and that comes up again and again. And even when he's in the hospital waiting for news of his wife, there are two Christmas trees with red lights. There's no white lights on them, they're all red. Red is a theme because it's supposed to be that the Mothman has red eyes, and that comes up again and again. We see that when he is looking down the road just before they see the Mothman, and then later after the crash, he goes back and he sees the same two red lights. That comes up again and again. And even so, like, there's other times where they just show kind of creepy things, like when his car breaks down in the middle of nowhere, there's a flash of light. And actually a friend pointed this out to me, and I had no idea until that came up. It looks as if there's a thunderstorm, but there's no thunder and there's no rain, and there's just a flash of light off on his right, and then you see, and it kind of makes a figure. That's one thing. Another is just the way they show things, like the Mothman can go through wires. They show a moth in the closet of the new house that they're gonna buy, that John Klein and his wife are gonna buy. They even show I don't know, other things, like you can see the imprint on where the Mothman supposedly burned his insignia or his face or whatnot in a tree, in the car, so on and so forth. We see it again and again. And so these themes, they come up again. And I think the creepiest one, is where you do actually see the Mothman. It still weirds me out to this day because it's not creepy and it doesn't freak me out. It's just odd. And I thought at first it was something wrong with the video editing or something like that, but it wasn't. It was actually purposely meant that way. So in the scene, John Klein is on his phone, and he's talking to his boss, who's yelling at him for not, for taking too much of the time, company's time, and chasing these whatever stories. They're not credible, they're not real news. And he tells him he's got to go to meet the governor and get that interview. And while John is having this argument with him, which I almost forget about the argument. He's standing next to a mirror, and the mirror is mimicking him, but off by a second. And it's so weird because it's a very tense moment where John Klein is about to lose basically everything he has, but there's just something wrong with the rest of the surroundings that don't match up with him in it. And he's arguing, and the mirror is off by half a second, and eventually you can totally tell that his reflection isn't even reflecting him. It's completely off, and it's the weirdest camera trick. Like, I would be totally disturbed if I saw that, in in my reflection. Like I can't even think about that. That'd be creepy as hell. But it really, and then he eventually slams the door, and then you see something in the mirror. And if you actually pause it, it's the Mothman, but it's kind of a blurred shot. Later, I found out that the way they shot this was they didn't do any camera effects. They just made a blurry lens to make it look like you couldn't, like something was there. And actually, I think they actually had a costume for it, but they just gave a blurry lens because you don't know. The other thing that I think that the director did great is he actually played a part both in the movie and as the Mothman. When they talked to Indra Cold, it's a creepy digital voice that actually sounds like a layered voice, and then when they take it later for forensic analysis, they can't even, it's all scrambled, so there's no actual words. But when John Klein's actually talking to him, it's a real voice and you can hear it. And it sounds like multiple people talking. But what the director said about this is that they wanted it to make it sound like it could be anyone. And if you listen closely, it sounds like both a man, a woman, and then just someone else. And it turns out to be several different people. And then at one part, it actually sounds like his wife in the undertones, and another time it actually sounds like the policewoman, and it could actually also sound like him. So this gave me to a theory that he's hearing all of the voices in his life at once talking back to him, and it's actually talking to himself. So really, it may not actually be some entity on the phone. It's just him talking to himself and hearing what he wants to hear. And that's scaring him because he's facing something he doesn't understand, can't comprehend, and something he doesn't want to face, which is grief. And I think that's super significant. And I still think this is nicely done because they take a creepy urban legend and make it kind of humanized to a theme of both grief and sadness, and then just acceptance. And I think that's what a lot of this movie is. It's about how to overcome a loved one's death, because it seemed like he was super happy. They finally got their life going, and then that was all taken away from him. And even his job, it seems like he doesn't even have anymore. And what do you do when you lose everything? Like, how you obviously, as a human characteristic, we want to blame something. Of course we want to blame something. We would be angry, we would be every kind of emotion we could think of, and someone has to pay for it. But in this case, it may not be anything that pays for it. It may just be that's life. And that's kind of a depressing thing to think about, but it's also at the same time kind of empowering at the same time, because John Klein eventually gets over it. He accepts that he can't control this, and he's not going to let it control his life. By letting go of that control, he allows himself to live again. And he goes then to spend Christmas with Laura Linney's character, and he moves on with his life. And of course, yes, the bridge happens and collapses at that last scene, but that's kind of like it's the culmination. It's like the climax in a way, but at the same time, it's also kind of the resolution, because I think it's the Mothman's, or at least one of the last attempts to try and get John Klein, but it doesn't work, because by the time that scene has already happened, John Klein already gave up. He hung up on Interpol, and he ripped the phone out of the wall, and even though it's still ringing, there's another creepy thing, he doesn't pick it up. He goes to go see Laura Linney's character, and then the tragedy happens anyway. And in a way, the bridge collapsing is not even the culmination. It's just, that's life. That's a crappy, unfortunate thing that happened. And while we see some weird supernatural elements around it, it doesn't mean that something caused it. It could be that just it was misfortune. So what I think, at least from my perspective, the Mothman is both a kind of catalyst of like grief, but he's also just the misfortune in life. And I think that's what a lot of people don't get in movies, is that the monsters, usually they're just monsters, or there's some kind of trope that we've seen 100 times over. But this is something different. This is grief, and it's just life. just getting over that and become, if you can get that past your Mothman in your life, then in a way you just live a better life. And I think that's a very human thing, and that's why I think this movie is both the scariest movie I've ever seen, because it's very near and dear to a lot of people, and it is something that actually happened. But it doesn't mean that it was something that caused it to happen. So that's what makes it creepy, is because there's still a mystery to it. But if I were in that position and I learned to accept that and move on, I think all of the the mystery around it and the supernatural around it would just kind of go away. And that's definitely what happens for John Klein. So that's why I think it's one of the scariest movies I've seen, because the actual urban legend that happened around it and the events that happen are truly creepy, because they're just eerie coincidences, but there's no proof. And then the bridge collapses, which in the actual timeline of events that actually happens, if you go and read it, and I'll put the links to probably some of the Wikipedia pages, is that they all happened very infrequently. They didn't happen like, on 2 months this all happened every day. No, they happened over, we're talking about maybe 10, 20 years. And we also have to remember this is the height of the Cold War. It's also the height of when people are seeing UFOs everywhere. So you have to take a lot of those stories with a grain of salt. And I know there's many, many, many videos that go on about, oh, here's proof and here's photographic evidence. Like, I don't buy into that. You can go read into that. I've seen a lot of them. But they kind of take away from the movie in a way, or even just the events themselves, because what made the events creepy was how many people within that region started seeing it. But when I delved into it later, I found out a lot of people were kind of piggybacking off of other people's stuff, and then it just kind of was a big game of telephone where this person was copying this person, but then they add something to it, and then it adds it, and then they start going off in these totally different tangents, and it starts becoming a whole mythos. And then you can't prove any of it because there's no physical evidence, and the people who did encounter the real stuff either are deceased or gone, or you have no concrete proof, so that makes it kind of just hard. At least within the Mothman prophecies, they did a very good job of kind of giving you enough that you can believe, but not enough that you are fully convinced. And so that's what I think is great about this movie. So that is my take on Mothman prophecies. And if you can actually check out the book by Alexander Lee, or I'm sorry, it's John Keel, not Alexander Lee. It's John Keel. It's called The Mothman Prophecies. So a little background on this: John Keel is the guy who wrote the book that became the movie. He actually went to the town and wrote down about the events that were happening and stuff like that. And I think, I haven't actually read the book myself. I'm actually a little bit too freaked out to read it because the movie was scary enough. But it doesn't have the plot that the movie did. In fact, that was kind of a later addition. He wrote more about the events and what people saw, and kind of helped build a mythos around it. And so that's what I think makes it creepy, because there's still an air of mystery. Like, you can still come away from this movie and not be like, oh, it's all in the guy's head, or oh yeah, the monster's dead and everyone can go home happy because they all survived, or the main characters. No, it's like nothing actually got resolved. The monster's still there, people still died. It's just John Klein. The biggest thing I think that gets resolved is John Klein getting over his wife. And I think that's probably the most important part. Now, at the box office, this actually didn't do that well, and I think there's a few reasons for that. One, it didn't meet the criteria of typical movies. This movie came out in 2002, and around that time, most horror movies were kind of the same, kind of slasher or gore fest, and then you start getting into movies around, I think a few years later, like Saw and stuff like that, where they're just becoming formulaic, and it wasn't scary enough. We had Blair Witch, and Blair Witch was still pretty good. I'll probably go over that again at some point, but This was a full production movie, and it actually was a thriller more than anything. There's no like pop up in your face, no gore fest, not even a lot of violence. There was some. I mean, there's implied violence too, but not in the way of blood and gore and people getting physically harmed, that kind of stuff. And that's what I think it makes it great, because it's scary that way, that something could hurt you or something is going to hurt you, but you don't know for sure. And that's what makes it really creepy. And I think that's what makes even a thriller movie creepy, is that there is the suspended notion that something negative or not great will happen to you, or the people that you love, or even the characters in the movie, something that you connect with, and that just kind of makes it creepy. Um, so that, I think that's what makes it a great horror film. So around the time it got about a 53% on Rotten Tomatoes. Actually, I don't even think Rotten Tomatoes was around back then, but if they were, I think they later scored it at 53%. It made about, I think, somewhere around 50 million at the box office worldwide. It wasn't amazing. It didn't get marvelous reviews, and I think that's why it's kind of underrated, because I found this movie at Hollywood Video, if you can remember back in those days. I found it on a shelf. I was like, oh, this looks interesting, just by the cover. And I'm like, all right, let me go check this out. So I took it home, watched it, and I was freaked out for at least 3 days. And I'm like, I can't handle this movie. Like, I can never watch this movie again. And yet, I think a few months later, I was like hyping this movie up to people because it scared me so bad. Watched it, I think maybe a year or two later, and then I've just kind of watched it successively over the years. It doesn't freak me out, but it still gives me chills, and I still probably wouldn't watch it at night all alone, but it has something. I still take away something from it, something new each time, and I think that's why this is my favorite, and this is why this holds up as a good horror movie. So, like I said, guys, sorry for the late stream, but I think that's my take on the Mothman Prophecies. That's my first Horror Thursdays, and I would love to hear your thoughts on it. If you haven't seen this movie, I would definitely go check it out. You can get it on Amazon Prime. I don't think it's on Netflix, but I definitely watch it on Amazon Prime. There's a myriad others. You can get it on Amazon anywhere, or download it somewhere. But we'll see. If you guys have any other suggestions about what movies I should watch, horror movie wise, for Horror Movie Thursdays, I would love to hear it, and also love to hear your takes and themes and what you got out of this movie if you've seen it. And I would love to discuss it. So yeah, shoot me a comment in the comment section, and if you like this video, click and subscribe, or follow me on Twitch on Social Litman, or on Mixer and Social Litman, and YouTube Social Litman. And I'm doing this from Restream. This is my second video from Restream. For those of you who don't know, Restream is a platform where you can stream to multiple platforms at once. And this you can do to Twitch, Mixer, Steam, and a bunch of others. It's free for the basic features. There's about like 20 or more platforms. Some of them I've never even heard of, but you can stream to, and signing up is easy, and even adding your channels to it is even easier. It takes about 5 minutes, and you can manage all that in a nice, easy to use dashboard. For things like streaming to Facebook Live, or I think even YouTube, or no, not YouTube, Twitter streaming, you have to pay for those features, but basic plans there, all of the pricing plans are all right there. It's pretty affordable. I like the free version just because it's the ones that I use. I use Mixer, Twitch a lot, and I like YouTube as a platform, so I think this is perfect for me. So yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts again on Mothman Prophecies. Hope you liked this video, and hope you liked the idea of Horror Thursdays. I'll be posting next week, and then tomorrow I'll probably be off, but during the weekend we'll be back on, probably streaming some Overwatch and getting back into competitor mode and talking about more games and stuff like that. Anyways, guys, thank you for joining the stream, and stay social.